Margaret Fields adjusted her glasses as she peered out the frost-covered window of her small home. The world outside was cloaked in a heavy snowfall, blanketing the streets of Willow Springs in pristine white. From her living room, the soft glow of her modest Christmas tree illuminated the space, a delicate reminder of traditions that once filled her house with warmth and laughter. At 82 years old, Margaret had grown accustomed to the quiet. Her children, now scattered across the country, called occasionally but rarely visited. It was easier for them to stay busy with their bustling careers and families. Margaret understood. Life had a way of moving forward, even if it sometimes left others behind. Still, she tried to keep the spirit of Christmas alive in her own way. That evening, she had spent hours carefully decorating the tree, hanging ornaments that had seen decades of holiday seasons. Her favorite, a hand-painted bauble from her late husband, Walter, hung in the center. It was cracked now, but she couldn't bear to part with it. The smell of gingerbread lingered in the air as she pulled a fresh batch of cookies from the oven. Baking had always been her solace, a connection to the past. She hummed a soft tune, setting the cookies on a tray near the fireplace. As Margaret sat down with a cup of tea, the house seemed to sigh with her. The silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. She picked up a photo album, flipping through pages of Christmases long past. Children in matching pajamas, Walter carving the holiday ham, the family dog lying lazily by the tree. Her reverie was interrupted by a sound. Faint at first, then unmistakable. A soft whimper. Margaret frowned and glanced toward the window. The sound came again, more insistent. Gathering her shawl, she moved cautiously toward the door. She wasn't one to open her home lightly, especially at night. Still, something about the noise tugged at her. Unlocking the door, she cracked it open and peered into the icy darkness. At first, she saw nothing. The streetlights barely pierced the swirling snow. But then, just at the edge of her porch, she spotted it, a small, shivering form. It was a dog. The creature was bedraggled, its fur matted with snow and ice. Its coat was a patchwork of brown and white, and its eyes, dark and round, met hers with a look that was equal parts desperation and hope. Margaret hesitated. She hadn't had a dog since Walter passed, and the idea of taking in a stray felt overwhelming. Still, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving it out in the cold. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, opening the door wider. The dog took a tentative step forward, its movements slow and cautious. Margaret fetched a towel from the hall closet, then knelt to wrap it around the animal. It flinched at first, but quickly relaxed as the warmth enveloped it. There," she said softly. The dog followed her inside, its paws leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. Margaret led it to the fireplace, where the flames crackled gently. She placed an old blanket down and gestured for the dog to settle. It curled up immediately, its tail tucked tightly around its body. From the kitchen, Margaret retrieved a small plate of leftover turkey. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," she said, setting the dish down. The dog sniffed it cautiously before devouring the meal with eager bites. Margaret watched, her heart aching for the creature. "Where did you come from?" she wondered aloud. "Did someone leave you behind?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but its eyes seemed to convey a quiet gratitude. For a moment, Margaret considered the logistics of keeping the animal. She shook her head. "I'll take you to the shelter tomorrow," she decided. "They'll know what to do." Still, as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dog's arrival wasn't mere coincidence. There was something about the way it had looked at her, as if it had chosen her for a reason. In her bedroom, Margaret lay awake, the soft sounds of the fire still crackling in the distance. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, muffling the world in its icy grip. But the house no longer felt quite so empty. Downstairs, the dog slept soundly, its chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Margaret drifted off with a curious thought. Perhaps this Christmas would hold a surprise after all. She didn't know it yet, but the little stray curled up by her fire would soon prove to be far more than a lost dog. Margaret awoke suddenly, her heart pounding. The clock on her bedside table read 2:17 a.m., but it wasn't the time that startled her awake. it was the sound. A sharp, insistent barking echoed through the house. Disoriented, she sat up, her breath fogging in the chilly air. It took a moment to remember the events of the evening. The snowstorm, the stray dog, its eyes so full of unspoken desperation. Now, it was downstairs, barking with an urgency that made her stomach twist. "Good heavens," Margaret muttered, slipping on her slippers and wrapping her robe tightly around her. She shuffled down the hallway, her knees protesting every step. The barking grew louder as she neared the living room. "Hush now," she called out, her voice firmer than she felt. What on earth is the matter? When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the smell hit her. It was faint but unmistakable. Gas. Margaret's eyes widened in alarm. She turned toward the kitchen, where the old oven stood. The dog, standing rigid by the doorway, barked again, its eyes fixed on her. "Oh no," she whispered, rushing to the stove. She had used it earlier to bake cookies, but in her distraction, she must have left the gas knob slightly turned. The faint hiss confirmed her fear. Her trembling hands reached out, and she quickly shut it off. The room fell silent except for the sound of her breathing. She turned to the dog, who was now sitting, watching her with a steady gaze. "You saved me," she said, her voice breaking. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter outside. If it hadn't been for the dog's barking, she might not have woken up in time. She knelt down, her frail hands brushing over its fur. "You're a little hero, aren't you?" The dog leaned into her touch, its tail wagging slightly. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It had been so long since she'd felt truly needed, so long since her life had been touched by something, or someone, that mattered this deeply. The next morning, Margaret prepared a simple breakfast, her movements slower than usual. She kept glancing at the dog, who now lay by the fireplace, watching her with quiet attentiveness. "I suppose you deserve a name," she mused aloud, setting a small plate of scrambled eggs on the floor. "Can't keep calling you dog, can I?" The animal sniffed the food before eating it delicately. Margaret smiled. "You're a polite one, aren't you?" She thought for a moment, her eyes drifting to the window where the snow had finally stopped falling. The world outside was dazzlingly white, untouched and serene. "Hugo," she said suddenly, "that suits you. Strong, noble, and just a little mysterious." The dog's ears perked up, as if in approval. Margaret chuckled. "Hugo it is, then." Despite her growing attachment to him, Margaret remained resolute in her plan to take Hugo to the shelter. "They'll find you a proper home," she told him later that morning, fastening an old leash she'd found in the basement around his neck. "Someone who can give you the care you need." Hugo didn't resist as she led him out the door, though he paused often, sniffing at the snow and wagging his tail. Margaret couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. As they walked, Margaret felt a strange pull in her chest. It wasn't just the physical effort of trudging through the snow. It was the creeping sense that she was making a mistake. But she brushed the thought aside. They had barely made it 2 blocks when Hugo froze. His body tensed, and he began tugging at the leash, pulling Margaret toward a narrow alleyway between 2 old buildings. "Hugo, stop that," she scolded, though there was no force in her words. The dog tugged harder, his movements insistent. Margaret sighed, her curiosity piqued. All right," she muttered, following his lead. The alley was shadowed and quiet, the snow piled high against the walls. At first, Margaret saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed the faintest movement near the far corner. Hugo let out a low whine, his tail wagging cautiously as he approached the source of the movement. Margaret followed, squinting against the dim light. There, huddled against the wall, was a young woman and a small boy. The woman's face was pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She clutched the boy tightly, her tattered coat barely large enough to cover them both. Margaret's breath caught. "Oh my goodness," she said softly. The woman looked up, startled. Her expression shifted from fear to guarded hope as she took in the sight of Margaret and Hugo. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, stepping closer. The woman hesitated before shaking her head. We don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Margaret's heart twisted. She glanced at the boy, who couldn't have been older than 5. His cheeks were flushed red from the cold, his small hands clutching at his mother's coat. Without thinking, Margaret said, "Come with me. You can't stay out here." Back at the house, Margaret set about making tea while the woman, Emily, and her son, Tommy, warmed themselves by the fire. Hugo stayed close, his tail wagging as Tommy reached out to pet him. "You've done a lot for us already," Emily said later, her voice trembling. "We don't want to be a burden." "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly. "It's Christmas. No one should be alone." As the day unfolded, Margaret learned bits and pieces of Emily's story. She had fled an abusive relationship, taking Tommy with her, but had nowhere to go. The shelter in town was full, and she had been sleeping wherever she could find a bit of warmth. Margaret listened intently, her heart breaking for the young woman. She couldn't imagine the strength it had taken for Emily to protect her son in such dire circumstances. Hugo seemed to sense the heaviness in the air. He moved between them, nudging Tommy gently and curling up beside Emily. Margaret smiled at him. "You've done it again, haven't you?" she whispered. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she thought about how much had changed in just a day. Hugo had come into her life unbidden, disrupting her quiet routine. But in doing so, he had brought something else, something Margaret hadn't realized she was missing: hope. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the faint stirrings of purpose. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was content. Downstairs, Hugo slept peacefully, his job, for the moment, complete. The house was alive in a way Margaret hadn't felt in years. By the second day of Emily and Tommy's stay, laughter echoed through the rooms, and the scent of fresh-baked cookies mingled with the piney aroma of the Christmas tree. Margaret had found an old box of decorations in the attic, and Tommy had enthusiastically taken charge of adorning the tree with whatever he could find. "Careful, sweetheart," Margaret cautioned as the boy balanced on a chair to hang a sparkling ornament. "I got it," Tommy announced triumphantly, his face beaming with pride. Emily watched from the sofa, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. "I can't remember the last time he smiled like that," she said softly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and sadness. Margaret sat beside her. "Children are resilient," she said, glancing at Tommy. "They just need a little warmth, and maybe a few cookies." Hugo, ever attentive, patted over and placed his head on Emily's knee. She smiled down at him, running her fingers through his fur. "I think he knows," she said, her eyes misty. Margaret tilted her head. "Knows what?" "That we needed this," Emily said. "All of it. You, him, everything." That afternoon, Margaret took Hugo out for a walk, while Emily stayed behind with Tommy. The streets of Willow Springs were still blanketed in snow, but the air was crisp and calm, with a faint promise of sunshine. As they strolled, Margaret found herself reflecting on the strange sequence of events that had brought Hugo to her door. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than coincidence. "Who do you belong to, Hugo?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Her question lingered in her mind as they walked. Determined to find answers, Margaret stopped by the home of her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who was known for her keen knowledge of the neighborhood. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Carter said when she saw Hugo. "That dog belonged to Mr. Simmons. You remember him, don't you?" Margaret frowned. "The older gentleman who passed away recently?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "That's the one. Sweet man. He doted on this dog. But after he passed, the poor thing disappeared. People thought someone took him in, but it seems he's been wandering all this time." Margaret's heart ached as she looked down at Hugo, who was sitting obediently by her side. "So, he's been looking for a home." Mrs. Carter smiled. "Or maybe he's been looking for you." Back at the house, Emily was in the kitchen, trying to make herself useful. "I thought I'd start dinner," she said, her tone apologetic. "Nonsense," Margaret replied. "You're a guest, not a cook." Emily hesitated, then set the utensils down. "It's hard for me to just sit. I've spent so long feeling like I had to keep moving, keep doing something, or else." Margaret nodded, sensing the unspoken weight of Emily's words. She placed a gentle hand on the younger woman's arm. "You're safe here," she said. "You and Tommy both." The words hung in the air like a vow, and Emily blinked back tears. As the day wore on, Margaret noticed small changes in herself. Her hands moved with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years, and her steps, though still slow, felt purposeful. Having Emily and Tommy around, having Hugo, especially, had rekindled something inside her she thought was long extinguished. Later that evening, Margaret decided to share a story she hadn't told in years. "Walter, my husband, used to say Christmas was for miracles," she began, her voice steady but soft. "When our youngest was born, we didn't have much. Walter had just lost his job, and we were barely scraping by. I remember thinking, how are we going to make it through? But that year, out of the blue, a neighbor showed up with a tree, gifts for the children, even a ham for dinner. We never found out who sent them, but it kept us going." Emily listened intently, her eyes wide. "Sometimes," Margaret continued, "the help you need comes in ways you don't expect. You just have to be open to it." As she spoke, Hugo settled at her feet, his eyes closed but his ears twitching. Margaret reached down to stroke his fur, her fingers lingering as if she drew strength from him. The peace of the evening was shattered by a loud knock at the door. Hugo jumped to his feet, barking sharply. Margaret, startled, rose from her chair. "Stay here," she told Emily, who had instinctively pulled Tommy close. Margaret opened the door to find a man standing on her porch. His coat was ragged, and his eyes were sharp and searching. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked, her voice firm despite her unease. "I'm looking for someone," the man said, his gaze darting past her into the house. "A woman. She's got a kid." Margaret's stomach dropped. She didn't need to ask to know who he was. "I'm sorry," she said, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "There's no one like that here." The man's expression darkened. "You're lying." Before Margaret could respond, Hugo stepped forward, his stance protective. A low growl rumbled from his chest, and his eyes locked onto the man with an intensity that made even Margaret shiver. The man hesitated, his bravado faltering under Hugo's unwavering glare. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Margaret closed the door, her hands trembling. Emily appeared moments later, her face pale. "Was it him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded. "He's gone now." Hugo saw to that. Emily sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "I don't know what I would have done if he—" "You're safe," Margaret interrupted, her tone resolute. "As long as you're here, you're safe." Hugo returned to Margaret's side, his tail wagging slightly as if to confirm the promise. That night, as the house settled back into a tense quiet, Margaret sat by the fire, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Looking at Hugo, she whispered, "You were meant to find us, weren't you?" The dog blinked at her, his expression calm and knowing. Margaret smiled, the flicker of hope in her heart now burning brighter than ever. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet stillness, the kind that only freshly fallen snow can bring. Margaret awoke to the faint sound of giggles coming from the living room. Sliding into her slippers, she made her way downstairs, where she found Tommy sitting cross-legged in front of the tree. Hugo was beside him, wagging his tail as Tommy showed him each ornament. Emily stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself, watching her son with a wistful smile. "Good morning," Margaret said warmly, her voice cutting through the soft hum of the moment. "Morning, Miss Margaret," Tommy chirped, holding up a star-shaped ornament. "Look what Hugo found under the couch." "Well, he's a better cleaner than I am," Margaret replied with a chuckle. Emily turned to her, her smile fading into something more serious. "I didn't sleep much last night," she admitted. "I kept thinking about him." Margaret's face softened. "You don't need to worry. Hugo and I won't let anything happen to you or Tommy." Emily nodded, but her tension remained. "I've been running for so long, I don't know how to stop." Margaret placed a comforting hand on Emily's arm. "Maybe you don't have to run anymore. Maybe it's time to let someone help." The morning passed in a flurry of unexpected joy. Tommy opened a small gift Margaret had managed to wrap, a wooden train set she had found tucked away in her attic. His excitement filled the house, each laugh like a bell ringing in Margaret's heart. Emily helped Margaret prepare a simple Christmas meal, the two women moving comfortably around the kitchen. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," Margaret said at one point, her hands deftly slicing potatoes. Emily paused, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I hope I can be half as strong as you one day." Margaret laughed softly. "Strength comes when you need it most. You'll see." As the sun began to set, the three of them, plus Hugo, gathered around the dinner table. The meal was modest but warm, and the laughter and stories flowed as if they had been a family for years. Margaret shared tales of her late husband and children, while Emily opened up about her dreams for Tommy, a life where he could feel safe and loved. "You've already given him more than most," Margaret said, her voice steady. "You've given him you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, focusing on her son's animated retelling of how he and Hugo had defeated the snow monster outside earlier. That night, Margaret sat by the fire, stroking Hugo's fur as the others slept. She thought about the man who had come to her door, the fear in Emily's eyes, and the courage it had taken for her to leave. Margaret had lived a long life, but she couldn't remember feeling this fiercely protective since her children were young. Hugo stirred beside her, lifting his head to look at her. His dark eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond his years. "You brought them to me for a reason, didn't you?" Margaret murmured. "But what now?" Hugo didn't answer, of course, but his tail thumped gently against the floor, as if reassuring her that she'd know what to do when the time came. The time came sooner than she expected. 2 days after Christmas, a knock at the door jolted Margaret from her morning tea. Hugo immediately sprang to attention, standing in front of the door and growling low in his throat. Margaret's heart sank. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. The man stood there, his presence as imposing as it had been before. This time, his eyes were sharper, more determined. "Look, lady," he said, his voice cold. "I know she's in there. Give her up, and I won't cause any trouble." Margaret's grip on the doorknob tightened. "You have no right to be here," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The man took a step forward, but Hugo's growl deepened, his body rigid with tension. Margaret squared her shoulders. "If you don't leave, I'll call the police." The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to Hugo, who looked ready to lunge at the slightest provocation. Then, with a sneer, he backed away. "This isn't over," he muttered before turning and walking away. Margaret shut the door, her hands shaking. Emily appeared moments later, her face pale. "Was it him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Margaret nodded. "He's gone for now, but we need to take this seriously. We'll go to the authorities today." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I can't keep living like this. Tommy deserves better." At the police station, Emily told her story, her voice trembling but steady. Margaret stayed by her side the entire time, offering quiet encouragement. The officers took Emily's report seriously, assuring her that measures would be taken to ensure her safety. As they left the station, the weight on Emily's shoulders seemed to lift, even if just a little. "Thank you," she said to Margaret, her voice filled with emotion. Margaret smiled. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. You just needed someone to remind you." Over the next few days, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Emily started making plans to stay in Willow Springs, finding support from local organizations that helped women in her situation. Tommy, meanwhile, had grown inseparable from Hugo, who seemed just as devoted to the boy as he was to Margaret. As for Margaret, her once quiet home was now filled with laughter, warmth, and purpose. She hadn't just opened her door to Hugo that snowy night. She had opened her heart to a new chapter in her life. On New Year's Eve, Margaret stood at her window, watching the snow fall softly under the glow of the streetlights. Hugo sat beside her, his head resting against her leg. "You changed everything," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Hugo looked up at her, his tail wagging gently. Margaret smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You're my guardian angel, Hugo. Always." And as the clock struck midnight, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet, unshakable hope for the future. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.